As the carriage jolted, sending Harriet gripping the edge of her seat for balance, Mr. Crawford lurched forward, his hand reaching out and clasping hers under the pretense of steadying her. "Ah, Miss Grant," he said smoothly, his fingers lingering far too long. Such treacherous roads, are they not? As his fingers brushed against hers, it felt like a pinch, sharp and unwelcome, sending an uncomfortable surge through her. Harriet pulled her hand away. "Thank you, but I am quite all right," she replied, her voice clipped but polite. Mr. Crawford's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew more self-assured. "You are too modest. A delicate lady such as yourself mustn't bear such discomfort alone." Harriet's unease deepened. The amused glint in his eyes made her skin crawl. She adjusted her position, turning slightly toward the window to put distance between them. He leaned back, unabashed, his gaze sweeping over her. "You know," he began, "you have a rare charm, Miss Grant. There's a sweetness about you that draws people in. Your naivety, your innocence. It's refreshing." His words struck her like a lash. Harriet's fingers curled tightly around the folds of her gown. "I hardly think that charm and sweetness are traits one should comment so casually on, Mr. Crawford," she said evenly, her tone cooler now. Mr. Crawford chuckled softly, unbothered by her shift in demeanour. "Ah, but it's precisely what makes you so endearing, Miss Grant." Harriet met his gaze briefly, but it stung, the intensity too much to bear. "Perhaps, but I find sincerity a far greater virtue." Though Mr. Crawford's words were smooth, the charm that had once seemed polished now felt rehearsed, its edges worn thin by something less sincere. She straightened in her seat, her mind churned with unease. The carriage slowed as it neared the Grants' estate. Harriet leaned toward the window, eager for the journey to end. When the vehicle came to a halt, she reached for the door just as it opened from the outside. "Harriet!" She froze, her heart leaping at the familiar voice. Edward stood breathless just beyond the carriage, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Mrs. Grant told me about the broken carriage and that you were riding with Mr. Crawford," Edward said, his voice steady but on edge. "I wanted to ensure you made it home without trouble." Edward stepped forward as Harriet stepped out of the carriage, his eyes softening as he noticed her trembling hands. He extended his own, steady and reassuring. "Here," he said gently. "Let me help you." Harriet placed her hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. It was the same motion Mr. Crawford had made earlier, yet it felt entirely different. Edward's hand was steady, not forceful, firm, but not demanding. His touch carried no hidden motive, only quiet care and respect. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward's gaze darted to Mr. Crawford, who seemingly refused to exit the carriage. His expression darkened, though he maintained his composure. "Mr. Crawford," he said evenly, "I trust the journey was uneventful." Mr. Crawford smirked, amused by his mischief. "Entirely uneventful, though I must say the roads leave much to be desired." Edward's attention shifted back to Harriet, his voice softening. "Are you sure you're all right?" Harriet nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I am. Thank you for coming back, Edward." Mr. Crawford, sensing the tension, bowed his head. "I shall leave you to your evening. Good night, Miss Grant. It was a pleasure." As Mr. Crawford's carriage disappeared into the night, Edward turned to Harriet carefully. "Harriet, I beg you to be truthful. Did he do anything to cause you distress?" Harriet hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the folds of her gown. She glanced at Edward, then looked down at the mossy cobbled path, her cheeks flushed. "There was something strange," she began, her voice faltering, shaking her head, unsure how to find the words. "When the carriage jolted, he reached for me. It didn't feel..." Edward's expression darkened as realization dawned. "Harriet," he said firmly, his tone laced with restrained anger. "Did Mr. Crawford harm you?" "No," she replied quickly, though her voice wavered. "It wasn't that. It felt wrong." Edward took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I see," he said, though the tension in his frame remained. "Is that all?" Harriet hesitated again. "He also said things about you. Rumours. He warned me to be cautious of our friendship." "Did he now?" "And what did he claim?" Harriet looked down, unsure whether to continue. "He implied that you might not be trustworthy and that not all friendships are genuine." Edward's expression was of frustration and shame. "I see. I wonder if he extends the same caution to himself," he said quietly. "Do you believe him, Harriet?" She met his gaze then, her uncertainty soft then steady. "I don't know what to believe, Edward," she admitted quietly. "But when he spoke ill of you, it didn't feel right. I couldn't stand to hear it." Edward's heart skipped, and a faint flush crept to his cheeks. Relief washed over him along with a bashful smile that tugged at the corners of his lips. "You defended me?" he asked, half wondering, half touched. Harriet nodded, glancing away as her own cheeks warmed. "Of course I did. I couldn't just let him tarnish your name." For a moment, Edward could only look at her, his heart full. Edward hesitated, then spoke carefully. "In truth, Harriet, I've heard things about Mr. Crawford, things that make me question his integrity. But I didn't want to trouble you with them." Harriet hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "If I may ask, what happened between you and Mr. Crawford to cause this?" Edward took a slow breath. "Mr. Crawford and I were once friends, but that was long ago. I trusted him, but his actions proved him unworthy of it." "What happened?" Harriet pressed. "He pursued the woman I was once engaged to marry years ago," Edward began, his voice low. "At the time I considered him a trusted friend, someone I had admired, but his intentions were far from honourable. He sought to win her affection, not out of love, but to secure the wealth he assumed would come with the match. When it became clear that her dowry was less substantial than anticipated, he abandoned her, leaving her reputation in ruin, as well as mine. The whispers that followed were almost as cutting." Harriet's expression was soft and aching, her eyes wide with heartbreak. She leaned closer, listening attentively, her lips parted in sorrow. Edward continued, "I had to face the truth that a man I had once trusted, a man I had called a friend, was capable of such calculated cruelty. When I confronted him, he dismissed it all as nothing more than a failed game. That was the end of any friendship between us." Harriet raised her hand, catching her gasp. "And now, he cares to turn me against you?" Edward nodded, his expression shadowed. "It would seem so. I suspect he perceived your gentle and trusting nature as something to take advantage of. But seeing me by your side, I imagine his grudge made it all the more appealing to pursue." Harriet felt an anger rise within her, but also slight betrayal. "But why wouldn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want to control your judgment," Edward said gently. "I trust you to find the truth for yourself, Harriet." "But I ought to have forewarned you," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "It grieves me deeply that I did not intervene sooner, that I failed to shield you from all of this. I can only hope you will pardon me, Harriet." Harriet studied him for a moment, her mind piecing together the differences between the two men. Mr. Crawford's polished charm now seemed hollow, calculated and shallow, while Edward's true sincerity carried a weight she hadn't fully realised until now. More than that, Edward had shown faith in her ability to find the truth for herself, without needing to be told what to think or do. It was a stark contrast to her family's well-meaning but often overbearing guidance, and she found herself appreciating Edward's trust in her judgment more than she could put into words. "Edward," she said softly, her voice emotional, "thank you for everything." He looked at her, warm and blissful. "There's no need to thank me," he replied, a faint smile gracing his lips. "It's simply where I feel most at ease. By your side, Harriet." Harriet's breath caught, her heart stirring at the sincerity in his words. They began walking toward the house, the cool night air wrapping around them. The silence between them was light and fluttering, tinged with a giddy excitement like the thrill of a childhood secret. Harriet found her gaze drifting to Edward more often than she intended, her thoughts turning over the quiet strength he had shown her. The realization came slowly, like the soft bloom of a flower in spring. Edward had always been a steady presence, but now she saw him differently, not just as a childhood friend, but as someone who made her feel safe, valued, and unexpectedly overjoyed. The thought made her chest tighten, a mix of nervousness and quiet joy taking root, as she realized she cared for him in a way she never had before. From the window above, Agnes stood watching, her expression alight with hope. "Francis," she murmured, waving him over to join her. "Look at them. Can you not see it? Harriet is beginning to feel something for him, I'm sure of it." Francis joined her at the window, his eyes following the pair. "It seems so," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Edward has always been patient, always seen her for who she is. Perhaps now she is finally seeing him too." Agnes giggled into her hands. "If they continue on this path, I dare say it won't be long before we have cause to celebrate a union." Francis chuckled softly, resting his hands on her shoulders. As Harriet and Edward reached the door, the glow of the house cast a warm light over their faces, illuminating them softly against the cool darkness of the night. For the first time, Harriet allowed herself to imagine a future with him, one built on mutual care and understanding. As they stepped inside together, the door closing softly behind them, Harriet felt the quiet thrill of a new beginning, the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could be truly seen, understood, and loved for exactly who she was.